The ambition to defy the Atlantic has always been measured in knots and steel, but for the American traveler of the late 1950s, the true frontier lay not toward the gray mists of Europe, but toward the shimmering heat of the Southern Cross. In the post-war era, the United States stood as a titan of industry, yet its merchant marine faced a cooling crisis of identity. The venerable Moore-McCormack Lines recognized that to capture the imagination of a nation now obsessed with the good neighbor policy, they needed more than just a ferry. They required a floating statement of American diplomatic and technological supremacy. This was the genesis of the SS Brazil, a vessel designed to turn the arduous journey to Rio de Janeiro and Buenos Aires into a high-speed ritual of mid-century elegance. The ship was not merely a response to the growing demand for South American coffee and beef, but a direct challenge to the prestige of European lines that had long dominated the southern routes. Constructing a vessel of this magnitude required a departure from traditional Atlantic architecture, moving toward a philosophy that embraced the sun rather than shielding the passenger from the spray. The technical blueprint for the Brazil called for a revolutionary Scandinavian profile, characterized by a sleek, low-slung silhouette and the radical emission of a traditional funnel in the center of the ship. Engineers instead diverted the engine exhaust through two slender king posts aft, leaving the highest point of the ship free for a magnificent solarium and observation deck. Beneath this aesthetic triumph lay a powerhouse of propulsion, two General Electric double-reduction gear turbines capable of churning out 35,000 shaft horsepower. This machinery was designed to maintain a consistent service speed of 23 knots, ensuring that the vast distances of the South Atlantic could be bridged with a reliability that rivaled the emerging jet engines of the time. The human element of this grand overture was rooted in a specific, optimistic nostalgia for a world that felt both expanding and manageable. For the wealthy industrialist or the diplomat's family, the Brazil offered a sanctuary where the social order of the pre-war years met the convenience of the space age. Moore-McCormack promotional brochures from 1958 promised an experience where the sun follows you south, emphasizing a lifestyle of leisure that began the moment one stepped onto the gangplank in New York. A sense of patriotic pride permeated the project, as every bolt and every yard of fabric was sourced from American soil, fulfilling a mandate to showcase the United States as the premier shipbuilder of the modern age. It was a time when the departure of a great liner was still a civic event, drawing crowds to the piers to witness the literal weight of American ambition sliding into the harbor. As the lines were cast off for the first time, the transition from the frantic energy of the North American pier to the rhythmic pulse of the open sea signaled a new chapter in maritime history. The passengers, dressed in their finest linen and wool, gathered on the promenade to watch the Manhattan skyline retreat, unaware of the technical complexities humped beneath their feet. The captain's log for the inaugural sea trials noted a remarkable lack of vibration, a testament to the precision-balanced propellers and the sophisticated hull design. Yet, as the ship cleared the Verrazzano Narrows and set a course for the equator, a lingering question remained among the crew and the designers alike. They had built a masterpiece of steel and light, but would this gamble on the southern route hold its own against the unpredictable temperament of the deep ocean? The technical gamble of the new hull began with a departure from the traditional shipbuilding hubs of the Northeast, finding its soul instead in the humid air of Pascagoula, Mississippi. At the Ingalls Shipbuilding Corporation, engineers were tasked with a feat of naval architecture that would push the boundaries of mid-century stability and comfort. The challenge was formidable, to construct a vessel capable of maintaining high speeds through the notorious South Atlantic swell, a rhythmic and heavy rolling motion that could render a lesser ship a misery for its passengers. To combat this, the Brazil became one of the first major American liners to be integrated with the Denny Brown stabilizer system. These retractable, fin-like appendages, controlled by sophisticated gyroscopes, could sense the onset of a roll and adjust their angle of attack to provide counteracting lift. It was a mechanical triumph that promised to turn a turbulent sea into a steady platform for the cocktail parties and gala dinners planned for the upper decks. Structurally, the ship was a marvel of material science, utilizing a hybrid construction method that favored speed and safety. While the main hull was forged from high-tensile steel to withstand the immense pressures of the deep ocean, the upper superstructure was largely crafted from lightweight aluminum. This strategic use of alloys significantly lowered the ship's center of gravity, a critical factor in enhancing its natural stability and fuel efficiency. The displacement of the vessel was carefully managed, ensuring that even with a full complement of cargo and 1,000 souls aboard, she sat with a graceful, shallow draft that allowed entry into the tighter harbors of the South American coast. Inside the hull, the compartmentalization met the strictest fire and safety regulations of the era, utilizing marinite, a fireproof asbestos-free silicate, to line the bulkheads, ensuring that the luxury of the interiors never compromised the security of the journey. The pride of the Mississippi shipyard workers was palpable as they watched the gargantuan frame of the vessel take shape beneath the southern sun. According to technical logs from Ingalls Shipbuilding regarding the 1957 launch, the assembly required a level of precision usually reserved for naval warships, with every weld inspected to ensure it could withstand the vibration of the massive turbines. A veteran shipwright noted in his personal memoirs that the Brazil wasn't just built, she was sculpted with a level of care that felt like we were sending a piece of our own town out into the world. This sentiment was shared by the community, who saw the ship as a symbol of the South's emerging industrial might. The launch itself was a choreographed dance of physics and celebration, as the 617-foot hull slid down the greased ways and into the water with a splash that signaled the birth of a new American titan. Yet, as the hull was towed to the fitting-out basin, the engineers knew the hardest work was yet to come. The integration of the ship's complex internal nervous system, miles of electrical wiring, plumbing, and the revolutionary air conditioning system, had to be perfect to meet the good neighbor standards. The transition from the raw, clanging environment of the shipyard to the silent, refined atmosphere of a luxury liner was a metamorphosis that required months of meticulous labor. As the final coats of Moore-McCormack green were applied to the hull, the focus shifted from the external shell to the internal organs of the beast. The question was no longer whether she could float, but whether the secret innovations hidden within her engine room would perform as promised when she finally faced the open horizon. The secret race against competing nations was not merely a matter of nautical speed, but a sophisticated battle for cultural and economic influence in the Western Hemisphere. As the SS Brazil took shape, the North Atlantic was already a crowded theater of prestige, dominated by the likes of the Queen Mary in the United States. However, the South American run remained a contested prize, where the Italian lines Augustus and Giulio Cesar offered a seductive blend of Mediterranean flair and veteran seamanship. For the American government, which heavily subsidized the construction through the Merchant Marine Act, the Brazil was a geopolitical tool designed to demonstrate that the United States could match the artistry of Europe while surpassing it in modern efficiency. The rivalry was so intense that maritime trade journals of the 1950s often spoke of the battle for the Southern Cross, a competition where the stakes were nothing less than the loyalty of the burgeoning South American markets and the patronage of the world's wealthiest travelers. Technically, the Brazil was designed to outpace her rivals not just in raw velocity, but in the consistency of her service. While the Italian ships were known for their beauty, they were often at the mercy of the rolling swells that defined the route between the continents. The American engineers responded with a hull form that prioritized a dry deck and a stable ride, aiming for a reliable 23-knot service speed that would shave days off the traditional transit time. This efficiency was coupled with a revolutionary cargo handling system, featuring shipwater side loading cranes that allowed the ship to load and unload without the cluttered, unsightly masts and booms of her competitors. By hiding the mechanical necessities of a working vessel beneath a sleek, aerodynamic exterior, the Brazil maintained the profile of a private yacht while performing the heavy lifting of a national flagship. The aesthetic of the ship was the primary weapon in this cultural offensive, shifting the paradigm from the heavy, dark-paneled luxury of the old world to a bright, optimistic new look. Where the European liners favored marble and velvet, Moore-McCormack embraced the seagoing sun motif, utilizing glass, light woods, and an open-air philosophy that reflected the American spirit of the time. This was a calculated move to appeal to the good neighbor sentiment, making the ship feel like a bridge between the skyscrapers of New York and the modernist architecture of Brasilia. A prominent design critic of the era wrote in a 1958 Maritime Review that the Brazil does not attempt to mimic a palace on land, She is the first vessel to truly embrace the fluidity of the ocean and the clarity of the American vision. This rivalry extended into the social atmosphere on board, where the crew was trained to provide a level of service that was uniquely and efficiently American. The competition for the blue ribbon of the South Atlantic was as much about the quality of the coffee served in the cafe as it was about the revolutions of the propellers. Passengers often compared the menus and the wine lists of the competing lines with the scrutiny of diplomats, looking for any sign of superiority. As the Brazil prepared for her debut, the tension in the Moore-McCormack boardroom was high. They knew that the eyes of the maritime world were on them. The ship was a gamble that modernism could defeat tradition, but the true test would come when she faced her rivals in the neutral, unforgiving territory of the open sea, where reputation was earned in the salt and the spray. The hidden innovations in the engine room were the true heartbeat of the SS Brazil, a silent power that separated her from the clanging, vibrating liners of the previous generation. While the passengers marveled at the teak decks and the sprawling lounges, 100 feet below the waterline, a mechanical revolution was unfolding. The ship was powered by two General Electric double-reduction gear turbines, a masterpiece of cold, gleaming steel and precision engineering. These turbines were designed not just for speed, but for a nearly silent operation that was revolutionary for its time. To achieve this, the gears were shaved to tolerances of 1/10,000th of an inch, ensuring that the transfer of power from the high-speed turbines to the massive propellers was as smooth as silk. This technical sophistication meant that even at full steam, a passenger in a midship stateroom could barely detect the rotation of the shafts, feeling only a faint, rhythmic pulse like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. Central to this subterranean world was the automation of the boiler controls, a step toward the future that reduced the physical strain on the black gang, the traditional name for the engine room crew. The Brazil featured two Foster Willoughby-type steam generators, which utilized a sophisticated combustion control system to maintain optimal steam pressure and temperature automatically. This was the machine age at its most refined, where brass-rimmed gauges and polished levers met the early stages of computerized feedback. The engineers, dressed in crisp white coveralls rather than the soot-stained rags of the past, monitored the high-pressure steam as it hissed through insulated pipes at temperatures exceeding 850 degrees Fahrenheit. The efficiency of these boilers allowed the ship to carry less fuel and more cargo, a critical factor in the economic survival of a modern American liner. The human story of the engine room was one of professional transition and intense pride in American craftsmanship. The transition from the old turbo-electric drives of the 1928 vessel to these high-pressure gear turbines required a new breed of maritime engineer. According to the memoirs of a Moore-McCormack chief engineer, the crew spent months in rigorous training before the maiden voyage, learning to trust the automated systems that now handled the delicate balance of air and fuel. There was a ghost in the machinery, he wrote, a sense that the ship was thinking for itself, adjusting its own breath as it faced the pressure of the deep. This pride extended to the maintenance of the space. The engine room was kept in a state of clinical cleanliness, with every pipe color-coded and every deck plate polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the ship's status as a showcase of national industrial might. Despite the clinical precision, the engine room remained a place of immense, harnessed energy that could be felt in the very marrow of the ship. During the final sea trials, as the engineers pushed the throttles toward the full ahead position, the hum of the turbines rose to a low, powerful whine that resonated through the hull. The technical logs noted that the ship achieved its design speed with ease, yet there were secrets known only to the builders, small adjustments to the pitch of the propellers and the tension of the drive shafts that were kept confidential from rival lines. These were the shipyard secrets that would allow the Brazil to outrun the competition and the weather alike. As the engine room telegraph finally clicked to stand by, the men below knew they held the reins of a thoroughbred, ready to prove its mettle on the long road to the Southern Cross. The tension of the first high-speed crossing was a palpable electricity that surged from the bridge down to the deepest recesses of the hull. On September 12, 1958, as the SS Brazil eased away from Pier 32 in New York, the air was thick with the scent of harbor salt, expensive perfume, and the faint, acrid tang of soot from the tugboats. This was the moment of truth for Moore-McCormack Lines. The culmination of years of design and millions of dollars in investment was now at the mercy of the Atlantic. Thousands of well-wishers lined the pier, a sea of waving handkerchiefs and trilby hats, as the ship's deep-throated whistle, a resonant, commanding blast, announced her departure. For the crew, the celebration was tempered by a professional anxiety. They were operating a vessel that was, in many ways, a prototype, and the eyes of the global maritime community were fixed on her performance as she transitioned from the sheltered harbor to the unpredictable swells of the open sea. Adjusting the trim of the ship as she hit the Gulf Stream required the delicate touch of a seasoned mariner and the precision of the new automated systems. The captain and his officers monitored the clinometer and the vibration sensors with unwavering focus, feeling for any shudder that might indicate a misalignment in the massive shafts. As the Brazil reached her open ocean gate, the Denny Brown stabilizers were deployed for the first time in a commercial capacity. The effect was near miraculous. As the ship encountered the first heavy rollers of the deep Atlantic, the expected pitch and yaw were smoothed into a gentle, rhythmic cradle. The technical achievement was undeniable, but the true test lay in maintaining this composure while pushing the engines toward their 23-knot service speed, a pace that would prove the vessel's superiority over the older, slower ships of the South American fleet. The passenger list for this inaugural run was a who's who of the American elite, creating a social atmosphere of high-stakes glamour and patriotic pride. Among the dignitaries was Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist Hal Boyle, who captured the spirit of the voyage for millions of readers back home. He described the world of effortless luxury, where the transition into the tropics was marked by the gradual shedding of heavy coats for light linens. In his syndicated column dated September 12, 1958, Boyle wrote, "To board the Brazil is to step into a future where the distance between two worlds is measured not in miles, but in moments of pure comfort." This human element, the laughter in the social center and the clinking of crystal in the dining room, was the ultimate validation of the designer's vision. The ship was performing not just as a machine, but as a theater of American soft power. As night fell over the first day at sea, the ship's profile against the horizon was a vision of modernism, her dummy funnel glowing with soft, indirect lighting that made her appear like a phantom of the future. The first sight of the southern stars began to replace the northern constellations, a symbolic transition that the crew noted with quiet satisfaction. However, the maiden voyage was not without its shadows of suspense. Every creak of the new joinery and every hum of the ventilation system was scrutinized by the accompanying shipyard engineers, who prowled the corridors with clipboards in hand. They knew that the honeymoon phase of the voyage would soon face the true test of the South Atlantic's legendary temperament. The cliffhanger remained. Would this mid-century marvel maintain her grace when the tropical sun set and the first real storm of the season appeared on the radar? Why the interiors of the SS Brazil felt like a dream rather than a boat was the result of a deliberate, revolutionary shift in maritime aesthetics that discarded the heavy, claustrophobic luxury of the past. By 1958, the rigid, gilded Art Deco of the 1930s had softened into a style known as Scandinavian modernism, a philosophy that prioritized light, air, and organic form. Walking through the main lounge was less like traversing a ship's deck and more like entering a high-end Manhattan penthouse or a sleek, contemporary art gallery. The designers at Moore-McCormack understood that their passengers were no longer seeking a floating castle, they were seeking a vacation that began the moment they crossed the threshold. The ceilings were raised to impossible heights for a vessel of her size, and the traditional portholes were replaced by expansive, floor-to-ceiling windows that invited the cerulean hues of the Atlantic into the very heart of the social spaces. Technically, achieving this sense of airy weightlessness required a sophisticated integration of modern materials that met the rigorous safety standards of the U.S. Coast Guard. The primary challenge was fireproofing. In an era when most liners were still laden with flammable heavy timbers and thick wool tapestries, the Brazil utilized maronite, a revolutionary, fire-resistant silicate panel, as the foundation for her walls. To prevent the ship from feeling like a sterile hospital, these panels were veneered with exotic, light-colored woods like bleached oak and satinwood. The furniture was a masterclass in mid-century industrial design, featuring slim profile chairs with tapered legs and tables constructed from brushed aluminum and formica. Even the lighting was a technical marvel, utilizing indirect, recessed neon and incandescent fixtures that could be dimmed to mimic the transition from a tropical sunset to a starry equatorial night. The human experience of this environment was one of profound sensory delight, as documented by architectural critics and enchanted travelers alike. Interior design features from a 1959 issue of Architectural Record praised the ship for its uncluttered elegance, noting that the lack of traditional nautical motifs, no brass anchors or heavy ropes, allowed the passenger to focus on the serenity of the voyage. One traveler wrote in her diary, "Everything is so bright and clean, the carpets feel like moss underfoot, and the walls seem to glow from within." This was the total environment design and practice, where every detail, from the typography on the menus to the abstract patterns in the hand-woven rugs, was curated to evoke a sense of forward-looking optimism. The use of vibrant textiles in shades of coral, turquoise, and gold reflected the colors of the South American destinations, creating a psychological bridge between the port of departure and the exotic ports of call. This aesthetic dream was anchored by the ship's most iconic feature, the solarium-topped observation lounge. Positioned where a traditional funnel would usually belch soot and heat, this space offered a panoramic view of the horizon, shielded by tempered glass and bathed in natural light. It was here that the transition from the North to the South Atlantic felt most profound, as the ship's profile seemed to dissolve into the sea and sky. However, the beauty of the Brazil was not merely for show, it was designed to influence the behavior of those on board, fostering a relaxed, sophisticated atmosphere that blurred the lines between the classes. As the ship hummed southward, the dream of the interior was about to meet the reality of the social machinery that kept the vessel running, a hidden world where the one-class experiment would be put to its first true test. The invisible wall between luxury and steerage was officially dismantled on the SS Brazil, replaced by a radical one-class philosophy that sought to redefine the American social hierarchy at sea. While older liners were partitioned by locked gates and segregated promenade decks, Moore-McCormack's mid-century marvel was designed as a unified social ecosystem. This was a bold experiment in egalitarianism, intended to reflect the democratic ideals of the post-war United States. However, the machinery of class did not vanish, it simply became more subtle, transitioning from physical barriers to the nuances of service and cabin location. The social center, a sprawling lounge that acted as the ship's town square, was the heart of this experiment. Here, a Midwestern school teacher on a once-in-a-lifetime vacation might find herself sharing a cocktail with a Brazilian coffee magnate. This intentional mingling was meant to foster the good neighbor spirit, yet the crew remained the silent arbiters of a social order that hummed quietly beneath the surface of the one-class veneer. Technically, the ship's layout was a masterpiece of flow engineering, designed to prevent the bottlenecks and dead ends that plagued older, multi-class vessels. The promenade deck was an unbroken circuit of teak and glass, allowing passengers to move fluidly from the formal dining room to the outdoor cafe without ever feeling restricted. The naval architects utilized a horizontal rather than vertical social organization. Instead of stacking classes on different decks, they distributed public spaces across the length of the ship to encourage movement. This required a sophisticated logistical network of service elevators and hidden corridors, known as crew alleys, which allowed the staff to move throughout the ship without disrupting the passenger experience. This social machinery ensured that while the guests enjoyed an atmosphere of unburdened freedom, the labor required to maintain that illusion remained entirely invisible, tucked away behind the sleek, wood-veneered bulkheads. The human experience of this social leveling was captured vividly in the diaries of those who walked her decks. One passenger wrote in late 1958, "There is a strange, wonderful feeling of belonging here. The lack of first-class only signs makes the ocean feel as if it belongs to all of us." This sentiment was echoed in the ship's daily program, which offered activities designed to bridge the gap between various backgrounds, from bridge tournaments to poolside horse racing games. Yet, the primary source material also reveals the lingering shadows of the old world. A veteran steward noted in his logs that despite the one-class designation, he could always tell a passenger's status by the subtle click of their heels on the deck or the way they addressed the wine sommelier. The social machinery was working, but it was battling decades of maritime tradition that favored the elite. This transition into a more egalitarian seagoing culture was not without its friction. As the Brazil steamed toward the equator, the social center became a microcosm of a changing America, where the old guard diplomats had to navigate a world increasingly populated by the rising middle class. The design of the ship, with its open-air pool and informal deck cafe, encouraged a relaxed dress code that would have been scandalous on a Cunard liner. Men in short-sleeved shirts and women in colorful sundresses became the new face of American maritime travel. This shift in the social landscape was a prelude to the modern cruise industry, but at the time, it was a high-stakes gamble. As the ship moved further south, the challenge of maintaining this sophisticated balance would be tested by the most basic of human needs, the logistics of feeding and entertaining thousands in the isolation of the open ocean. Chapter 8: Logistics of a City. The impossible task of feeding thousands during a gale was a feat of hidden industrial choreography that occurred far beneath the teak decks and cocktail lounges. While the North Atlantic was famous for its sudden ferocity, the run to South America presented a different logistical challenge: the transition through the extreme humidity of the doldrums while maintaining the crispness of a five-star Manhattan kitchen. On a ship like the SS Brazil, the galley was not merely a kitchen, it was a high-output factory operating 24 hours a day. When the ship encountered a gale, the logistics of a city shifted into a defensive posture. Every plate, every crystal glass, and every heavy copper pot had to be secured or fiddled onto tables to prevent them from becoming projectiles. Yet, the Moore-McCormack standard dictated that the menu remain uncompromised. The sight of stewards balancing silver trays of Chateaubriand while the hull groaned under the pressure of a 40-foot swell was a testament to a level of training that bordered on the superhuman. Technically, the ship was a self-contained fortress of preservation. To sustain a 2-week voyage with over 1,000 souls, the Brazil utilized massive reefer cargo holds, refrigerated spaces that were as sophisticated as the engine room itself. These holds were divided into temperature-controlled zones, ensuring that South American beef remained at a different humidity than the delicate California lettuces or the French cheeses. The galley itself was a galley of tomorrow, gleaming with the latest stainless steel innovations from General Electric. It featured massive electric ovens, infrared broilers, and high-speed dishwashers that could sanitize thousands of pieces of china in an hour. The plumbing and ventilation systems were designed to whisk away the heat and odors of cooking, ensuring that the scent of roasting meat never drifted into the elegant social center, maintaining the illusion that the food appeared by magic rather than through industrial labor. The human element of this operation was a rigid hierarchy of culinary professionals, many of whom had spent their lives at sea. According to the ship's manifest and kitchen inventory logs, the Brazil carried enough food to sustain a small town for a month, including 3,000 pounds of butter and 10,000 eggs for a single crossing. A junior chef wrote in a letter home, "In the galley, we do not see the sun or the waves, we only see the clock and the endless line of silver platters. When the ship rolls, we lean with it, our knives never missing a beat on the chopping blocks." This invisible army of cooks, bakers, and butchers worked in 8-hour shifts, fueled by coffee and the relentless rhythm of the turbines. Their pride was tied to the grand buffet, a midnight ritual where ice sculptures and intricate aspects were displayed with the precision of a military parade. The sheer scale of the ship's consumption was reflected in its waste and water management systems. The Brazil was equipped with high-capacity evaporators that could turn thousands of gallons of seawater into pure, drinkable water every day, a technical necessity for a ship traversing the tropical heat. As the sun beat down on the upper decks, the passengers remained blissfully unaware of the thousands of pounds of ice being crushed or the miles of piping delivering chilled water to every cabin. This seamless integration of heavy industry and delicate hospitality was the hallmark of the great liner era. But as the ship moved further into the deep tropics, the focus began to shift from the logistics of the belly to the logistics of the soul, as the famous faces on board began to shape the ship's growing mythos. The celebrities who shaped the ship's mythos were more than mere passengers, they were the architects of a shimmering, ephemeral world where the boundaries of international diplomacy and Hollywood glamour blurred. As the SS Brazil glided toward the Southern Cross, her passenger list often read like a redacted file from the State Department or a casting sheet from a major studio. From the sleek social center to the hushed corridors of the upper deck, the ship played host to figures who commanded the world's attention. Brazilian ambassadors returning from Washington mingled with American industrial titans, while stars of the silver screen sought the relative anonymity of the long southern voyage. This high society presence transformed the ship into a floating embassy of American soft power, where a quiet conversation over a gin and tonic in the nightclub could influence trade agreements or cultural exchanges between the two Americas. Technically, the ship was uniquely equipped to cater to this elite clientele through its advanced ship-to-shore communication systems. In an era before satellite links, the Brazil featured a sophisticated radio telephone room that allowed CEOs and diplomats to remain in constant contact with their terrestrial empires. The technical logs of the Moore-McCormack Line detailed the installation of high-frequency transmitters that could pierce the tropical atmospheric interference, ensuring that the ghostly halls were never truly disconnected from the pulse of global affairs. Furthermore, the ship's security was a marvel of discretion. The layout allowed for VIPs to move from their oversized lanai suites to private dining alcoves without navigating the main thoroughfares of the ship. This invisible architecture provided the privacy that the era's most famous faces demanded, all while they were surrounded by the hum of 35,000 horsepower. The atmosphere of the ship at night was an intentional masterpiece of lighting and sound design, tailored to the tastes of the mid-century elite. The nightclub featured indirect, recessed lighting that bathed the room in a soft, amber glow, designed to complement the evening gowns of the women and the sharp tuxedos of the men. According to the ship's guest register and various social columns, the air was often thick with the scent of expensive Cuban cigars and the rhythmic clink of ice against crystal. One socialite wrote in a letter to a friend in New York, "The Brazil is a stage, and we are all merely playing our parts under the most exquisite spotlights." This human element, the laughter, the whispered secrets, and the occasional scandal, gave the ship a soul that no amount of engineering could replicate, turning a steel hull into a repository of high society memory. Yet, for every famous face that graced the promenade, there was a sense of the ghostly in the ship's quiet hours. Late at night, when the music faded and the celebrities retreated to their staterooms, the Brazil became a labyrinth of shadows and machinery. The steward on the graveyard shift would walk the long, carpeted hallways, passing the closed doors of people who held the world's fate in their hands, hearing only the distant, reassuring drone of the turbines. This contrast between the vibrant, public celebrity of the day and the silent, mechanical isolation of the night defined the ship's dual nature. As she crossed the equator, the mythos of the Brazil as a sanctuary for the powerful was firmly established. However, the prestige of her guest list would soon be tested by a force that cared nothing for fame or fortune, the raw, unbridled power of a North Atlantic winter. Chapter 10, Weathering the North Atlantic. The night the ocean almost won occurred during a late December crossing, when the SS Brazil was caught in the maw of a rapidly intensifying extratropical cyclone. To the passengers huddled in the lounges, the sound was the most terrifying element, the deep, metallic booming of the hull striking waves that had reached heights of 40 feet. The Atlantic was no longer a highway but a battlefield of white foam and black water. The rehook of this night lay in the sudden vulnerability of the floating cathedral. Even with 35,000 horsepower, the ship felt like a toy in the hands of the elements. In the dining room, the heavy furniture, bolted to the deck plates, strained against its mountings as the ship took rolls exceeding 30 degrees. The scream of the wind through the slender king posts created a dissonant, haunting whistle that could be heard even in the soundproofed staterooms, a reminder that only a few inches of Mississippi forged steel separated the guests from the abyss. Technically, this storm was the ultimate validation of the ship's engineering specifications and her structural integrity. The scantlings, the internal beams and frames that formed the ship's skeleton, were subjected to torsional stresses that pushed the metal to its elastic limit. On the bridge, the captain monitored the strain gauges, ensuring the hull did not pant or flex excessively under the weight of the water crashing over the bow. The Denny Brown stabilizers were pushed to their maximum operating pressure. They hissed and groaned in their recesses as they fought to keep the ship upright. To prevent the propellers from racing and damaging the turbines when the stern rose out of the water, the engineers had to manually throttle the steam, a delicate dance of timing and intuition. The hull plating, though stressed by the freezing spray, held firm, proving that the lightweight aluminum superstructure had succeeded in keeping the center of gravity low enough to prevent a catastrophic capsize. The human experience during these hours was a mixture of silent terror and practiced professional calm. According to a captain's log entry regarding a similar 1962 storm, the order was given to dog down all exterior hatches and restrict passengers to their cabins. A stewardess later wrote in her memoirs about the surreal sight of the main lounge. The floor-to-ceiling windows, which usually invited the sun, were now obscured by walls of solid green water. It was like being in an aquarium at the bottom of the world. Despite the chaos, the crew continued their rounds, delivering tea and sandwiches to terrified passengers, their steady footsteps a psychological anchor for those who believed the ship was foundering. The one-class experiment was tested here as well, as the shared danger erased the last vestiges of social pretension. In the face of the North Atlantic, every soul on board was equal. As the dawn broke through a bruised, gray sky, the storm began to abate, leaving the Brazil battered but victorious. The teak decks were scoured white by the salt, and the mahogany railings were encrusted with ice, yet the ship remained on course. The transition from survival to recovery was swift. The social machinery resumed its rhythm as if the night of terror had been a mere dream. However, the experience left a mark on the crew, who gained a new respect for the vessel's resilience. They had seen the limit of human engineering and the limit of the ocean's fury, and the ship had emerged with her dignity intact. The cliffhanger, however, shifted from the weather to the machinery. Having survived the storm's weight, could the engines now survive the demand for absolute, record-breaking speed? Chapter 11, The Speed Record. Pushing the turbines to the breaking point was never a matter of vanity, but a necessity born of the grueling logistics of the South American schedule. While the SS Brazil was designed for a steady service speed, there were moments when the pressure of lost time, due to harbor delays or the aforementioned Atlantic storms, demanded that the chief engineer open the nozzles and unleash the full potential of the General Electric power plant. The rehook of the speed record lies in the sensory shift that occurred throughout the ship when the revolutions per minute of the shafts surpassed their design limits. In the staterooms, the gentle hum of the ventilation was replaced by a high-frequency vibration that rattled the crystal decanters and sent a shiver through the very bones of the passengers. This was the sound of 35,000 shaft horsepower fighting against the immense drag of the ocean, a battle where the friction of the water against the hull created a wake that stretched for miles behind the ship like a white, churning scar. Technically, the feat of high-speed running required an extraordinary level of coordination between the bridge and the engine room. As the captain signaled for full ahead, the engineers monitored the superheated steam temperatures with obsessive precision, knowing that a single degree of variation could lead to a catastrophic blade failure in the high-pressure turbine. The double reduction gears, which reduced the thousands of RPMs of the turbine down to the 100 or so required by the propellers, were subjected to heat and torque that pushed the limits of their lubrication systems. To maintain this pace, the fuel consumption climbed exponentially. The Foster-Wheeler boilers roared as they consumed tons of bunker C fuel oil per hour, turning the water in the tubes into a searing, invisible force. The hull itself, engineered for efficiency, cleaved through the swells with a bone in her teeth, a massive, curling wave of white spray that rose as high as the promenade windows, testifying to the ship's raw kinetic energy. The human element of these record-breaking runs was characterized by a mixture of exhilaration and professional stoicism. Engineering performance reports from Moore-McCormack reveal that the crew took immense pride in beating the clock, often arriving at the pilot station in Rio de Janeiro hours ahead of schedule. A passenger, an executive for an American automotive firm, wrote in his journal during a particularly fast transit, "There is a power under our feet that feels almost sentient. We are moving faster than any city has a right to move, and yet the service at dinner remains as unflappable as ever." This was the paradox of the great liner. The more the machine was pushed to its physical limits, the more the crew worked to maintain the illusion of effortless tranquility for the guests. The black gang below might be dripping with sweat in a 110-degree engine room, but on the deck, the only sign of the speed was the incredible force of the wind whipping through the solarium. However, the pursuit of the speed record was a double-edged sword that began to reveal the inherent costs of the liner era. While the Brazil could outrun almost anything on the water, the sheer volume of fuel required for such sprints was staggering, eating into the ship's profitability in an increasingly competitive market. The technical logs noted that while the turbines remained reliable, the stresses of high-speed vibration began to take a toll on the ship's interior joinery, requiring constant maintenance to keep the Scandinavian American elegance from showing its age. This relentless drive for speed was a final, desperate gasp of the maritime age trying to prove its relevance. As the ship reached the pinnacle of its mechanical power, a new shadow began to loom over the horizon, one that didn't move across the water, but through the air. The day the luxury ended and the camouflage began was not marked by a single event, but by a chilling shift in the geopolitical winds that forced the SS Brazil to prepare for a role she was never meant to play. While she was a jewel of civilian travel, the Merchant Marine Act that funded her construction mandated that she be dual-purpose, capable of being converted into a troop transport within a matter of days. The rehook of this era lies in the sudden, jarring intrusion of military necessity into the world of Art Deco and cocktails. As tensions flared in the early 1960s, secret drills were conducted in the dead of night, where the crew practiced darkening the ship, extinguishing the glowing dummy funnel and the expansive lounge lights to render the vessel a ghost on the radar. The once vibrant Moore-McCormack green hull was suddenly viewed not as a brand, but as a target, and the possibility of graying out the ship with naval paint hung over the company like a darkening cloud. Technically, the conversion capabilities were built into the very marrow of the vessel's design. Beneath the plush carpeting of the main lounges were reinforced deck plates designed to support the weight of heavy gun mounts should the need arise. The high-capacity evaporators, originally designed to provide fresh water for passenger showers and swimming pools, were recalibrated to support thousands of soldiers in a high-density troop configuration. Moore-McCormack's 1960s annual reports reflect the increasing costs of maintaining these defense features, which added weight and complexity to a ship already struggling with the rising price of bunker C fuel. The double reduction gear turbines, while efficient for luxury cruising, were also ideal for the rapid, long-range deployment required by the Department of Defense, making the Brazil a permanent, if reluctant, member of the National Defense Reserve Fleet even while she served Chateaubriand in the dining room. The human cost of this looming change was felt most acutely by the crew, who watched the passenger lists begin to thin as the Cold War intensified. A veteran steward recorded in his log, "There is a different air on board lately, the laughter in the social center feels forced, and the talk is no longer of the sights in Rio, but of the news from Washington and Havana." The good neighbor policy, which the ship was built to embody, was being strained by a world that felt increasingly divided. The primary sources of the era show a decline in the carefree one-class mingling, replaced by a sense of watchful anxiety. Travelers who once spent weeks at sea began to look over their shoulders, and the ship's role as a floating embassy began to feel more like a liability than an asset. As the mid-1960s progressed, the aesthetic of the ship began to mirror this transition. The once pristine light woods and vibrant textiles started to show the wear of a ship that was being pushed harder with a diminishing budget for refurbishment. Maintenance schedules were stretched, and the total environment design that had once felt like a dream began to feel like a relic of a more optimistic time. The transition was subtle but undeniable. The ship was moving from her golden age into a period of cold, hard utility. The cliffhanger was no longer whether the ship could survive the ocean, but whether she could survive the shifting priorities of a nation that was beginning to look away from the sea and toward the sky. The sound in the sky that signaled the end for the sea was not a roar, but a high-pitched, crystalline whine that began to pierce the quiet of the mid-Atlantic. In October of 1958, mere weeks after the SS Brazil made her triumphant debut, the Boeing 707 entered commercial service, effectively beginning the countdown for the great ocean liners. The rehook of this chapter lies in the invisible obsolescence that began to settle over the ship's gleaming decks even as she was at her prime. To the passengers on the Brazil, the sight of a vapor trail 5 miles above the observation lounge was a curiosity, a thin white line etched across the tropical blue. But to the executives at Moore-McCormack, it was a death warrant for the traditional transport model. The jet could bridge the gap between New York and Rio de Janeiro in a matter of hours, while the Brazil required 12 days of constant steaming, feeding, and labor. Technically, the ship attempted to pivot into a new role as a cruise ship rather than a liner, a transition that required significant mechanical and structural alterations. To compete with the speed of air travel, the Brazil had to offer something the pressurized cabin of a 707 could not, the luxury of time in the expanse of the ocean. Engineers looked at ways to make the ship more resort-like, which included the addition of more outdoor leisure space and the expansion of the air conditioning systems to handle longer stays in equatorial ports. However, the high labor costs of a U.S.-flagged vessel, combined with the staggering fuel consumption of her high-pressure turbines, made the economics of cruising a difficult equation to balance. The very turbines that had been her greatest strength, designed for consistent, high-speed transit, were now an expensive liability in an era where the destination, not the journey, had become the primary product. The human realization that their world was vanishing was captured in the shifting tone of newspaper editorials and passenger correspondence. By the mid-1960s, the end of the liner was a frequent topic of lamentation in the American press. A long-serving deck officer wrote in a letter to his wife, "We are becoming ghosts before our time. We sail with half-empty dining rooms while the sky above us is crowded with people who are too busy to see the water." The sense of mourning was balanced by a desperate attempt to stay relevant. The ship began to host cruises to nowhere and shorter Caribbean loops, trying to attract a younger demographic that liked the vacation time of the older, nostalgic elite. The one-class philosophy was now used as a marketing tool to present the ship as a friendly, accessible alternative to the perceived coldness of flight. Despite these efforts, the aesthetic of the ship began to feel like a time capsule rather than the future. The mid-century modern furniture that had looked so revolutionary in 1958 now seemed quaint compared to the burgeoning psychedelic and space-age designs of the late 1960s. The Moore-McCormack annual reports grew increasingly grim, detailing the struggle to compete with foreign-flagged ships that operated with a fraction of the Brazil's overhead. The transition was nearing its inevitable conclusion, moving from a battle for speed to a battle for survival. The cliffhanger for the Brazil was no longer about her status as a flagship, but about whether she would be sold for scrap or find a way to reinvent her steel bones for a generation that had forgotten the rhythm of the waves. Chapter 14, The Final Crossing. The emotional goodbye of the last crew began not with a roar, but with a somber, heavy silence that draped over the ship as she prepared for her final Moore-McCormack voyage in 1969. The rehook of this moment lies in the profound sense of finality that permeated the steel. After only 11 years of service, a vessel designed to last 30 was being retired, a victim of shifting economics rather than mechanical failure. As the SS Brazil sat at her pier in New York, the usual bustle of full ahead was replaced by the quiet, methodical process of laying up. For the men and women who had called the ship home, this was more than a change in employment, it was the end of a specific American dream. The final captain's dinner was a masterclass in professional poise, where the wine flowed and the silver gleamed one last time, yet the toast was not to the future, but to the memory of a decade that had vanished as quickly as a wake in the night. Technically, the process of mothballing the Brazil was a complex engineering operation designed to preserve her sophisticated systems for a future that was, at the time, uncertain. The high-pressure turbines were not simply turned off, they had to be pickled with protective oils to prevent the internal corrosion of the delicate blades. The massive Foster Wheeler boilers were drained and treated with desiccants to keep the Mississippi-forged tubes from rusting in the humid harbor air. Below decks, the social machinery was dismantled with clinical efficiency. The exquisite mid-century furniture was tagged and covered in protective plastic, and the miles of teak decking were treated with specialized sealants to withstand the neglect of the layup pier. This was the technical death of a ship, the systematic silencing of every pump, fan, and light until the vessel became a cold, dark shell of its former self. The human element of the final crossing was captured in the tears of long-serving staff and the quiet reflections of the passengers who had booked the last voyage specifically to say goodbye. One eyewitness account from the final arrival in New York describes a scene of heartbreaking dignity. The band played Auld Lang Syne as we passed the Statue of Liberty, and for the first time in my career, I saw the chief engineer come up from below with grease on his face and moisture in his eyes. This was a community of 1,000 souls being dissolved. The stewards, many of whom had served on the 1928 Brazil before this one, folded the linen for the last time with a precision that felt like a religious rite. They were the custodians of a level of service that the jet age would never replicate, a world where the human touch was as important as the speed of the transit. As the last passenger stepped off the gangplank and the "finished with engines" command was signaled on the telegraph, the Brazil entered a state of limbo. The ship remained moored in the backwaters of the industry, a steel ghost waiting for a second act that many feared would never come. The aesthetic beauty of her Scandinavian lines was now obscured by the grime of the city and the lack of a polishing hand. The transition from a living, breathing flagship to a dormant asset was complete. However, the legacy of the Brazil was not destined to end in a scrap heap just yet. The cliffhanger for this legendary liner lay in a strange, academic rebirth that would see her circumnavigate the globe not for profit or prestige, but for the education of a new generation that had never known the golden age of the sea. Why these steel ghosts still haunt our modern world is found in the enduring resonance of their design and the lives they touched long after their commercial relevance faded. The SS Brazil did not vanish into obscurity after 1969. Instead, she embarked on a remarkable second act that would see her renamed the Universe Explorer. The rehook of her legacy lies in her transformation from a vessel of exclusive luxury into a floating campus for the semester at sea program. For decades, the very halls that once hosted diplomats and Hollywood starlets were filled with the energy of thousands of students, turning the ship into a global classroom. This transition ensured that while the good neighbor policy of the 1950s had evolved, the ship's mission of cultural exchange remained intact. She became a bridge between generations, a tangible piece of maritime history that allowed young minds to experience the vastness of the world at a human pace, far removed from the sterile speed of a modern jetliner. Technically, the Brazil's longevity was a testament to the over-engineering of the Ingalls shipyard and the enduring reliability of her General Electric turbines. Even as she aged, her hull remained sound, and her stabilizers continued to smooth the path across the world's most challenging oceans. However, the march of time and the tightening of international maritime safety regulations, specifically the safety of life at sea, SOLAS, requirements regarding fire suppression and cabin materials, eventually made the cost of maintenance insurmountable. In 2004, the decision was made to retire her permanently. Her final journey took her to the desolate shores of Along, India, the world's largest shipbreaking yard. There, the Scandinavian lines were methodically dismantled by hand, a process that saw her high-tensile steel and aluminum superstructure recycled into the raw materials of a new century, though her blueprints remain a gold standard in naval archives for their balance of form and function. The human legacy of the ship is preserved in the vibrant community of semester at sea alumni and the nostalgic memories of the original Moore-McCormack passengers. For many, the Brazil was the site of their first encounter with the Southern Hemisphere, a place where the scent of teak wood and the vibration of the deck became synonymous with the thrill of discovery. Memorial reflections from former students often speak of the soul of the ship, a quality that modern, boxy cruise ships, built for maximum capacity rather than aesthetic grace, seem to lack. One alumnus wrote, "To study on the Brazil was to feel the weight of history beneath your feet. She taught us that the world is large, beautiful, and worth the time it takes to cross it." This emotional connection is the true ghost of the vessel, haunting the digital archives and the mantelpieces of those who keep her photograph in a place of honor. The aesthetic influence of the Brazil lives on in the DNA of contemporary cruise ship design, which has slowly returned to the resort-style open-air philosophy she pioneered in 1958. The dummy-funnel solarium and the integration of indoor-outdoor social spaces are now standard features of the multi-billion-dollar industry, yet few modern vessels match her lean, purposeful profile. As we look back at the SS Brazil, we see more than just a ship. We see a monument to a moment in time when American optimism was forged in steel and the ocean was a theater of elegance. She remains a symbol of the eternal wake, the idea that a great ship never truly disappears as long as the stories of her crossings continue to be told. The era of the great ocean liner may have set, but in the quiet of a harbor or the swell of a deep-sea wave, the spirit of the Brazil still sails, a reminder of when the journey was as magnificent as the destination.